Well, one of the interesting thing with smaller projects is that I think like a lot of times people think that they need to have a giant budget to hire a good designer.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people reach out to us with smaller projects and they assume that we wouldn't take it on because it's a small project.
Yeah.
Therefore, they have to go with the cheap guy who works around the block,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And it's not always true. You don't always need to have a giant budget, even for a small project, in order to hire good people.
Yeah.
I think it's about, again, understanding who they are, how they work, and if it's the right fit.
The way we decide to take on a project is really less to do with scale, the size of the project. It's more to do with the quality of the outcome and also the people we're going to work with.
Yeah.
So we've done projects that were very, very tight budgets, but they were really good people and we wanted to help them. And they had an eye for design and they wanted something that we were in line with. That's perfect. That's fine.
Just to kind of like go backwards a little bit, for people who are wondering what is a small project,
Right.
like is it a 5,000 square foot home is a small project compared to like a 25,000 square foot home?
Well, sure, in that case, yeah,
in
sure,
that
it's relative.
case, yeah, everything is relative. You have to put things in context. But I would say most likely a small project is if, let's say, it's just one room in a house and not a whole house remodel. That would be considered a small project.
Well, that's a good point that we should talk about because there is this threshold that a certain amount of work needs to take place and a certain amount of vision from the architect and designer needs to be allowed to create a good outcome. So where that threshold is, in other words, is if we're approaching someone says, I want to have, reinvent my life. I want to have a new feeling house, but I only want to change X, Y, and Z, very specific things kind of scattered throughout a home, then that's something we're very hesitant to do because very likely the client's expectations are, again, a new experience, new kind of living experience. But we know to get there, again, depending on the house, to get there, you're going to have to do more than just, change a few walls here and there and change a few millwork pieces. And any architect or designer listening knows that kind of sporadic scope is kind of a nightmare. And so that's kind of where I would draw the line in most cases. But like you said, small is completely relative. I think budget also comes into play here. So if a project is sizable in terms of square footage and scale, let's say it's a 6,000 square foot new house, new construction. Like that's a nice sized house, a nice sized project, but the budget is tight. Then we could also say that a lot of what we're going to talk about here definitely applies.
Yeah.
Definitely applies.
It's a case-by-case basis, and that's where, again, picking out the right people for the right job is crucial. And so for smaller projects with, let's say, tighter budgets, I think deciding to hire an architect or a designer and even a contractor could kind of go two ways. It could go well, and it could go really badly.
Sure.
I mean, it's like
There's
that
not
for
a lot
any
of middle ground,
project,
yeah.
but you don't... Your choices of who's going to take on the project and who's available for what you have to offer is probably much more limited.
So part of what you said too, which is interesting, is that if you are a client and you have a smaller project and you want to hire this particular architect or designer because you like them, you kind of have to think about ways to make it appealing for them. In fact, that applies for when we're looking for contractors for small projects. We think about, okay, why would this contractor be interested in doing it? And sometimes they're interested in the project just because we're involved. And they're like,
Right.
well, if you're doing it, then I want to do it. So amongst the professional community, it is about relationships. Everyone will put that at the very top of the list in terms of how they decide who to work with and what projects take on. It's always relationships, the quality of the people. But one of the other things you said is that in terms of the architect or the designer that you're hiring, one of the things to be mindful of is the scope of the design work they're going to do. So generally, the higher end architects and designers will do more scope and be more thorough with things, and the lower end ones will be less so. Okay. So it's a common mistake where clients will start working with somebody, an architect or a designer, thinking that they're going to design 1 through 10 things. It's more like 1 to 100 is his actual scale. 1 to 100 things, right? They're going to do all of those 100 things for me. And they don't do the proper research in the beginning. So they enlist that architect, they work with them, and after 3 months of working with them, which is a decent period of time, they realize, oh, you're only doing 10 of the 100 things. Yeah. Now I have to fill in that 90, or the contractor has to, which is a whole can of worms, which we'll get into. Or I have to hire someone else now to do that because I didn't know that you were going to draw the interior elevations of my house. Now I have to find an interior designer, quotes, to like do it for me. So that's the first thing, is knowing the scope of design. And I would say even more specifically, when you're hiring an architect, it has become more common now for architects to just do, quote, the architecture, which is erroneously equated to just the exterior and a floor plan, and then leave the rest to whoever, right?
Yeah, and I would call these people probably not an architect. I would call them drafters.
Yeah,
you know, especially if they're on the cheaper side of things. You're not getting design. You're getting most likely just a rough layout and maybe some permit drawings if you need to, but the amount of care, thoughts, and work that goes into a project is what's required to provide design services.
Yes.
If you're not putting that in, that is not design services.
And a lot of those practices that we've come across, those architecture offices, I would agree, it's kind of more like a drafting service because it's much more transactional.
Yeah.
So you pay me some money, I draw some plans, I draw the outside, I give you the plans, and then we're done. And if you are a person who is interested in having a nice house or a nice remodel, like you're interested in nice things and design, I can tell you 110% that's not the path you want to go down. It's tempting because that person's probably going to be really cheap, but again, if you're wanting that quality, it's just not going to happen. And trying to go with that individual, as we described, and sort of push them along to get to the level that you want them to be at also never works. Because it's not, first of all, it's not their interests. And secondly, it's not their business model. Their business model is to be super fast and, quote, efficient, and frankly, just do poor design very, very quickly, just much more turnover. And you can't take someone whose life is built around that model and say, okay, you know, instead of doing kind of mass production mode, let's go into highly custom, a lot of back and forth and finesse over details. It's not going to work.
Yeah, and that's why their fee is so low. It's because it's extremely limited in what they're going to give you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the other aspect of the design process is there's a lot of communication with the client, a lot of back and forth. It's a very personal relationship. And so when it comes to designing houses, that is a particular interest that one has to have. Like, you can't design custom houses or remodels for people if you're not interested in working with people. It doesn't work, right? The other thing that is very common, I think, when hiring an architect or designer and they provide a partial design service, the other threshold we see is when they don't specify the materials of the project.
And that's, again, that's crazy. Like, how could you design even just the facade of a house without thinking of what it's going to be?
Yeah.
And then even if you know it's going to be stucco, stone, concrete, or whatever, well, if you care about what you do, right, you want to make sure that it's going to look right. Mm-hmm. There is a zillion colors in everything, single material that those can come in, right? And if you make the wrong choice, it could look terrible, even if they're nice materials to start with.
Yeah, I agree. And so when we talk about specifying materials, I do want to be clear. So what an architect or designer should be doing, let's say the project calls for brick, right? What they should do is specify the exact brick, meaning we source it from a supplier and we get samples. We look at the samples, we compare it to another 3 or 4 or 5 samples and say, no, this is the company we're going to go with. Brick is a standard size, but this is the exact size of brick, and this is the exact layout of brick, and this is the spacing of the mortar. Like, everything is specified. Or if it's hardwood flooring, we don't say, oh, it's hardwood flooring that's sort of beigey, sort of like this reference image. Go find something like that, client or contractor. No. We specify the exact flooring from the exact company. We specify the wear layer, how thick it is, the stain, how it's coated, how it's laid down, the orientation. And even when we get to site, we might go through the pile and specify these boards will go here and there because we don't want all the boards with knots to be clumped in one corner, or we want to weed out all the ones with knots, whatever it's going to be. So when I say like specify materials, I mean specify the material. And that's to the degree that it should be happening. Because you don't want the other people, the contractor or the client, to have to do any guesswork when it comes time to build, right? When it comes time to build, the contractor's job and their subs, Their only job is to build. You don't want them to be guessing or to be making decisions which would impact the design, which fall into, all the things I mentioned about the hardwood flooring or the brick.
And that ties into the second point, which is basically when you hire people of that level, meaning like a lower fee type of professional,
sure,
you do get a lower level of drawings. Let's just be frank.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The drawings are either incomplete, like you don't have interior elevations if the architect designed only the exterior facade of your house. You don't have certain key details in the design that, somebody might want to drop before the contractor figures out how to build. And if you don't have finishes selected, you might not get some of those detailed drawings where the finishes are shown.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have a tile or stone countertop that has a specific edge detail, well, if there is no drawing, you can't really figure out the dimension.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. It's up for interpretation. So you're just starting to work on a project that instead of being a solid piece of cheese, it's a piece of cheese that has a bunch of holes.
A Swiss cheese.
It's a Swiss cheese. Okay. And you kind of have to figure out how to complete the project with a piece of Swiss cheese. You have to complete the cracker and the slice.
Right. Okay.
Starting with a piece of Swiss cheese. So it's tricky.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
And that is tricky because there is more gaps for interpretation, for miscommunication, for unknown, for decisions made on the fly. So it's not really the best way to go about a project, especially if you are tight in budget.
Especially if you're tight on budget and especially if you care about what's going on.
Yeah.
So, the architecture, design, and then construction process, communication is a big part of achieving success in those processes. And the gaps in communication occur when there's a lack of information. And therefore, people, from one person to the next, they don't know what they're supposed to do. Specifically, when you go from architect and designer and their drawings to the contractor and their subs. Right? That's a very important line of communication that has to be clean, clear, and thorough. And when it's not those things, then you have people on the site going, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So the problems with that, as I said before, one, then you have people either making stuff up on site, which is not good, or it slows things down because now people are paying for people to be on site and they're sitting around going, I don't understand this detail because it's not drawn, or I don't understand this detail because it's poorly drawn, or I have to make up this kitchen layout because no one drew it for me. And so all of that guesswork, that's what slows down projects and that's what increases the cost. On the subject of cost too, one of the biggest downsides to not having a good set of drawings from your architect or designer is that you can't accurately price the project, right? A contractor can only accurately price a project if he or she has a very thorough set of drawings, right? Otherwise, it's like, any contractor listening, they know. They get calls all the time from clients and architects saying, can you give me a price for this? And the first thing they say is, give me a drawing. Because if you don't, then there's, again, too many things left open to interpretation or just complete guess in that case. And it's just one of those instances where, again, a lot of people think, well, the drawings seem good enough. I think we can sort of get an estimate, kind of, and we'll be okay. And I'm sure it's going to work out. That's just not a path you want to go down because the prices are going to always be greater than what you think they are. So that's the other big benefit of, again, paying a little bit more for drawings to then know how much things are going to cost and then ultimately save time and money.
And then the third point of hiring, architects or designers at a certain level is, of course, their involvement during construction.
It's a big one.
And that's kind of a big one because I think a lot of clients, especially on those maybe small projects or even big projects, they have a tendency of thinking that I could just skip the designer on that phase because I already would have all the drawings. The contractor just has to build. Why do I need to pay somebody to be part of that? Mm-hmm. I could kind of run it if I need to, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a great contractor and if you have a great set of drawings, that might be possible, although it's probably more of a miracle situation than like most often, because there is other things that show up. If you have a Swiss cheese level of drawing set and a Swiss cheese level of contractor, then that's too many holes to make a complete piece of cheese. You kind of have to understand that. You're gonna try to be the filler of all those holes, and at some point you're not gonna know how to do it. You're gonna gonna be stressed out. You're gonna give up. Things are gonna go sideways. You won't know what to do. You won't know what to say. You're just gonna end up spending a ton of time and money trying to figure it out. So that's never my advice, and I'm probably a bit biased because I am a professional and that's my job to offer that service. But in any case, if a client wants to save money, I'll probably be like, this is not where you should be saving money.
Because, and this gets to another point later on, but the cost and return equation of a client trying to do CA, most often by the time the project is done, the client says like, that wasn't worth it. Did I save money? Yes. Was it worth the headache, the stress, and the confusion, and the delays, and whole list of things? No. I would have spent another 5% of whatever fee, or 10% of fee, or whatever the number is, to not have that take place. And what's interesting too is some clients who we've worked with on small projects, we don't have to convey this to them. They're like, no, you need to be involved. I want you involved during construction. Please be involved. And it's like, perfect, you get it. So I guess this is more for people who are on the fence. And for those people, I would say that any client that we've come across, so non-professional we've come across, who has done a construction project and wanted to achieve a certain level of quality, and they attempted it without an architect or designer doing CA, construction administration, the service provided during construction, they say, I will not do that again. So I hope that gets across to people who are kind of like on the fence. It's just something that, I want to save people a headache. It's mainly what it is.
No, and I mean, and if you're worried about the cost of that, then I think you could maybe put in the agreement with the professional you're hiring, like a certain number of hours. So at least it's not zero, right?
Yeah.
And you feel comfortable knowing exactly what you're getting and how much you're spending, rather than not having it at all and having to try to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the solutions to finding a good architect and designer is, one, don't assume because they look established and fancy and expensive that they are going to be expensive, and don't assume that they won't take on your small projects.
Right.
Again, it's all about, for us and many people we know, many professionals we know, it's about fit, quality, and the client, and many other factors we take into consideration, honestly. The other thing to do, which is very simple, is just ask the person you are about to hire what their services include and how it's going to go. In other words, just ask them to describe in detail their process. And that conversation could last half an hour, could last an hour, but it should be more than like a 2-minute conversation. I designed some stuff, we do some this and that, and then we're done. No, like have them talk through the process, because any good architect or designer will have an established process that they've honed and refined and changed over years. And they will happily get into the details with you.
Ask them enough questions that you understand what you're paying for and what you're not going to get. Because there is this assumption that, well, I hire an architect. Like, isn't that what architects do? Like, am I not going to get that service? And we've come across that, a few potential clients that reach out to us where they were kind of in a bind with their current designers. And the thing is, it seems like maybe from the get-go, the scope of work and the scope of services was not clearly established and understood by both parties. And I think that's a very important conversation to have. And, I don't know other designers and architects' contract, what is listed on there. Typically, in our contract, we list the services that we provide. So it's pretty clear this is what you're going to get. But I think it's important also to ask what they will not be providing on a more informal conversation. So, I am not going to get interior design floor plan. I'm not going to get interior elevations. I'm not going to get cabinet details. I'm not going to get help selecting finishes. I'm not going to get an architect to show up during construction to work with the contractor, because that's not part of what I'm paying them for.
Yeah.
Those questions, because it will highlight the gaps. And if you don't know who's supposed to provide those services, then you can ask them, well, do you typically help clients selecting finishes, or do I have to go hire someone else? Or how am I going to go about it? That's my first time doing a project. So, you have to gather as much information as you can.
I like that way of getting to the answers, because it tends to be that when people in general, ask a professional what they provide and they give you answers, there's a tendency for everybody to say, okay, well, they've said that they're going to provide A, B, and C. There's a tendency to assume, therefore, they're going to also provide D, E, and F, and G, which is not the case.
And if you've never done a project, you don't know what are those other things you need to get to do the project.
So I do agree that asking what they don't do it's a very good way of doing it, because they will for sure have answers for you in most cases, especially if you're at a lower tier of professionals. And then that allows you to kind of pull at the thread further and say, okay, if you're not going to do that, what about this and this and this and this? And then slowly the real picture becomes revealed. To be honest, it's easy for us when people ask what we do and don't do, because our answer is we do everything. Name something, and that's part of our service, because we're a holistic approach. That's what we do. That's what we believe in. So it's very, very simple. The only line that's drawn for us really is when it gets to landscape architecture, and this is a different conversation, but like one of the things we don't do is we don't specify planting. Like, you have a green thumb, but we don't. That's not our territory.
No, it's not our expertise. I mean, and of course we don't do like structural engineering and like all of those things. Like that's not.
Well, engineering also categorically is a completely different profession. Yeah. Moving on to the next professional that you would hire, which is a contractor. So some of the things to be mindful of when you go with smaller time contractors are, first is design collaboration or lack thereof.
Yeah, I mean that's like the big one. Actually, I just had one who like was terrible lately on a small project, and it's just not good. Like, you know, a small project's already complex because you're trying to be as efficient and as good with what you're doing and with what you can do, right? So you don't need to throw in egos and people who don't know how to work with others. That's just not necessary. So yes, the first one is poor design collaboration. If you get into a certain tier of contractors, let's say mid and low, definitely low, like cheaper contractors, they kind of usually do their thing. And a lot of them, you know, I mean, a lot of them could have ego, especially if you're a female. And if you're a designer, then for some reason they might have been traumatized in past experiences. It didn't go well. So they kind of have this stereotype about working with designers. So if that's who they are, then maybe they're not the right person to collaborate with a designer.
Oh, they aren't the right person,
because at some point that's going to come back, you know?
Yeah. It's the same exact thing as I was saying earlier about hiring an architect who only does short, you know, incomplete drawings as a business model. It's the same thing for for contractors like this. To each their own. As you said, a lot of these contractors, they do their own thing, which is they just want to get on site, kind of hammer it out, and then bounce.
Yeah.
And there is a certain type of client and project where there's clients who want that, right? And that's fine. This conversation is not for those people. It's for those people who want something better than that. But when there's this, so taking a step back, the challenge with residential construction and architecture and design is that the spectrum within which people practice and how they practice is large.
Oh, yeah.
It's from like 0 to 1,000. There's an ocean of different ways of doing things. Compared to, let's say, in the commercial space, the way people operate tends to be a lot tighter, like the variations are less. So in the residential space, it's tough because if you're a client who wants the absolute most cost effective and that's your top priority, then it's kind of easy to find your people. If you're a client who wants the very top end, the high end, the best of the best, it's also honestly easy to find your people because they're there and they exist and we know many of them. If you're a client who's operating kind of like in the middle, or especially if you had a tighter budget but you want something a little bit nicer, that's where it gets super, super tricky. And that's where you will find in the middle a lot of contractors who operate in the way you're describing. And I think the key takeaway with this point, the design collaboration aspect of a contractor, is whether or not they're actually and sincerely interested in working with an architect and a designer to help them achieve and construct their vision, right? I'm not saying their vision because in terms of like ego, it's mine and not yours. It's not that, but that's just the reality. When you hire an architect or designer, the client is paying someone a good amount of money to come up with a vision and then convey it to the contractor and effectively tell the contractor, this is what you are building. How you build it, that's up to you, and we'll collaborate on that. But this is what you're building. It's not up to you at all to make your decisions about what should be taking place or what's going into the project. And a lot of contractors, they love that. They don't want to be in charge of deciding the color of white with the client. They don't want to touch that. But some they
don't like being told what to do.
They don't like being told what to do.
In that case, then they should not be working with architects or designers.
And it's not just a matter of ego too, it's the entire workflow, right? So when they're constructing something on site, if there's an architect involved, they will come on site, look at the work and not inspect it, but kind of give oversight and say, this is not looking correctly, this detail, you need to fix it per the drawings, or this is not quite right, we need to figure it out. And if you think about that as a scenario occurring over and over and over, once a week or multiple times a week over the course of months or years, right? A person who's willing and interested in having those conversations, totally different from someone who's always operated on their own without a designer and has no interest in talking to those people.
So one of the things with that poor design collaboration, it kind of affects every single aspect of the project throughout, I would say.
Right.
The first one is the relationship, right? The collaboration between the three parties, the client, designer, and the contractor, that could be affected if the contractor is not accustomed to work with a designer or an architect. And that relationship could get messy.
Sure.
So I think, good vibes is always great. The next thing is drawings. A lot of smaller time contractors are just kind of like doing things quickly
on the fly without drawings.
On the fly. And I'm not saying all of them are like that. Not all small contractors are like that, but there is, some that are. They're not accustomed to read drawings, honestly. Some of them, they just don't want to. They're not interested. Then maybe they've never learned and they don't want to learn it. Yeah. But they're not, they just don't look at drawings, or maybe they don't know how to read them, honestly. So that could be a problem in the construction. Because if someone else did a design and documented it through drawings, the person who's building it is not looking at that, there's going to be gaps in what's going to be built. And then the client won't be happy. The client's going to ask the contractor to build what was in the drawings, and the contractor is going to be like, well, it wasn't clear, this and that. And then it's this whole arguing about getting the project that was designed to what it should be and pointing fingers. And that's just not a good relationship to have.
Yeah, the gaps is an interesting way to describe it. And this goes directly back to what I was saying earlier in a point about architects and designers. Like, you want to avoid gaps in communication.
Yeah.
And our job, a good architect and designer, our job is to produce a set of documents where there's no gaps. So it's very clear what everything is. But that document set, that drawing set, is only effective if the reader is willing to read it.
I mean, I love doing drawings, but I'm not doing that for myself to give to my mom,
It's funny because one of the biggest complaints that everyone would hear from an architect is like, the contractor never looks at my drawings. They never look at my drawings. You hear this all the time. And there's a few things that I would say in response. Well, first, maybe you're not working with the right contractor, A. And B, even for a contractor who wants to read the drawings and they're like a legit good contractor, it's a lot of time to read drawings and so what we always do is we have a session and we sit down with the contractor and maybe even the subs and say, point at the things that need attention, especially the special things, the challenging things, to force kind of a slow pace of walking them through it. Instead of saying, here's an encyclopedia, have fun, read that in a week, and then build everything exactly as was written in the encyclopedia. That's a really difficult task. But walking them through it like a presentation, that helps information be conveyed, again, without any gaps.
Yeah, and if you're talking about a room, which is a kitchen, a bathroom, or a small room, it's not that much drawing, so it's not an impossible task. The third thing to that, I would say, is that if you're an architect and people are not looking at your drawings or not understanding them, then make sure your drawings are extremely clear, extremely thorough,
Yes.
Because, we see a lot of drawings. There's all kinds of levels of drawings out there. There's some that are extremely good, very detailed, everything's there. And there's some that there is gaps on drawings. So
yeah, and that's where, I don't know how a client would vet good drawings versus not. But, I mean, yeah, that's a tough one. I was just trying to think. It's sort of like, this is not really true, but the more ink that's on the page, the better, because that means there's more detail and it should look clean. This is just getting really specific now, but like the tag should be in line, like things should be very, very organized, but very complex looking, you don't want, so what it should not be is very sparse, just a few lines and like kind of tags and annotations that are not in line. Like everything should be very crisp.
And that's a very superficial way of judging for people who do not know how to read drawings.
That's true. That's fair. But any good architect, when you're producing drawings, it's partly to do. You do this because you need it to be easily read by people in the field.
Yeah.
And during construction, it's total chaos. It's loud. It's dusty, and so you need your encyclopedia that you've written to be ultra clear. That's why. Good architects, their drawings are fastidious, and they're super organized, and they're really, it's kind of like a chef. They're like extra intense about their drawings, because it really does make a difference. The third point with contractors is communication between them and the architect and designer, not just in the drawings, but I mean like actual verbal or written communication. So more specifically, we will communicate with our contractors through text, phone, and email, right? Because when they're in FaceTime, when they're on site and they have a quick thing, call us or text us if they're out somewhere. So to choose the photograph, FaceTime us to look at stuff if we don't need to visit the site for whatever thing they're considering, they're talking about. But in addition to all that, it sounds very kind of silly, but email is very, very important. And
Look. We're in 2024.
Yeah.
All right. Email is how people communicate now. You cannot not have an email address and not email people if you have a business. Unless you're selling rocks at the corner of the street to your neighbors, then maybe you don't. But no, but come on, like everything's done by email. You can run a project or a business by texting people. Like, how would you do your taxes if everything was text?
Yeah. You
couldn't, right? You have to keep record. You have to keep things organized. You have to be able to like follow up on things. Like, how do you do that? So, I always tell clients and contractors, if there's any emergency, anything, like, text me, call me. But if there is anything else, it should be in an email.
Always email.
And you should have, basic things, but you should have like maybe the name of the project in the subject, so I know what it's about. So if I need to like search a conversation we had 6 months ago, I could easily find it. I mean, there is like some sort of basic protocol.
Yeah.
It's just basic process. And if this basic process is not there, to me, that's a red flag, because it tells me how much on top of their stuff people are or not, how organized they are, how thorough they are, how detail oriented they are.
Yeah, and this is also a general difference between contractors and architects. Architects spend more time behind a computer than contractors do, clearly.
Yeah.
And builders, they're on site doing stuff. So it kind of makes sense that architects would push for email and contractors would push for not email. The reason why email is critical is, one, all the high-end contractors use email. Everything runs through email. And secondly, it is, like you said, the record keeping. You need to be able to keep track of everything. And again, these projects, it's not a 1 week long if it was a 1 week long project, yeah, sure, let's text, because I can scroll through a week of text very easily. We're talking about months or years of work between us and a contractor. And the idea that half or even a third of the communication is just by text and not tracked through an archived way of communicating is a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's just a really bad idea.
Well, a small project would probably not be years, but still, even if it's like 6 months, 3 months, I don't want to be texting for 3 months. Like, that's not what I do.
No, because also something will go wrong. Multiple things will go wrong. To be honest, multiple things will go wrong throughout the project and during construction. And it's very important that we all be able to go back and find that message that says it should have been this way or that way. It's not to blame someone, but it's to understand why things took place the way they did. And sometimes also, frankly, we'll have a conversation with a contractor about, whatever detail. Months go by and no one can remember what we talked about. But it's like, I know we talked about this. I know we had a half an hour phone call and we problem solved it and we have the answer. So let me go find it real quick so we don't have to rehab that conversation, or we don't have to guess, or, all those other things.
And if you have an email address too, like I'm an architect and I'm sending drawings to a contractor, they gave me their email address, so they have one. They don't reply to my email. Like, again, like, hello, like, yeah. I'm not seeing you on the other side opening an envelope with my email in it, so you need to let me know you got it. Like, just simple things.
Bigger contractors, they have different people assigned for different tasks. So they'll have a site super who's there on site observing everything every day. And then they'll have, sometimes they call it like a project manager, or there's different terms for it, but someone that is basically behind a desk and they're running communications and conveying stuff to the people on site and then to us. And, sometimes those two individuals are kind of sandwiched into one, but nevertheless, it's protocols, it's operations, it's people as having all the systems in place. And that's what you're really looking for when you're trying to find a good contractor. The other thing that comes up, of course, is budget and schedule. In terms of, I don't mean in terms of the actual cost and how long things take, but what I mean is knowing the budget and knowing the schedule. Again, the legit contractors, they establish a very clear construction cost of the project up front, and they tell you exactly how much their fee is going to be, oftentimes based on that construction cost, and they give you a schedule. They say, okay, this month is going to be this work, and next month is going to be that work, and then da-da-da-da, and I'm going to allow this period of time because it might be longer or less, and then this is the date that you can move in, right? And that schedule will be updated throughout the course of construction, for sure. That's how a good contractor operates. But a lot of contractors who are smaller, and as you put it, they kind of just do their thing, they don't want to make a budget. They don't want to break down all the construction costs of all the pieces, and they don't want to make a schedule in Excel.
Well, I'm sorry, if you don't want to, then you're not the right guy. I mean, again, if I'm a client and I have a very limited budget into what I can spend to redo, let's say, this kitchen, I need to know exactly, or like at least roughly how much it's going to cost me and where is the cost going. You can't just spew a number at people and expect them to agree. Like you want transparency. And if there is no transparency given, it means that it's maybe out of laziness. They have not done a breakdown, so they're just giving you a number. Or they've done their math and I don't know, maybe they're overcharging you, undercharging you, whatever they're doing, or they're putting more things here and there and they don't want to share it with you. But you're paying for that service, you're buying that kitchen and what it takes to get it done. You should know what it takes to get it done.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Like you buy a car, right? Yeah. And they list you all of the options that you're going to pay for. And that's why the price at the end ends up being what it is. Well, you should have at least those rough lines. I'm not asking to list every single screw that's going to be part of the kitchen. Like, I don't really care about that. But like, at least...
cost of framing, cost of the materials, cost of installing materials, cost of the purchase items, like appliances and things like that. It should all be in there. Cost of finishing, cost of painting, it should all be listed. And I do also want to emphasize something you said earlier is that there are smaller sized contractors in their operation, not physical size, where they do all these things. They do all these things. They do all these things because they know it's the right protocol and they know it makes projects more efficiently. And also it's just a personality.
Well, no, but I think, I think they do all these things no matter the size of the company because they care. They care about it and they care about providing a good professional service. The one that really pisses me off are the ones that just don't care. And they're just here to like do the work, get the check and get out. And they absolutely do not care about customer service and like how much work and love they put in what they do. Like, I don't care. Then that's your business model. And then you should clearly put it on the front of your door that is your business model. So the people who don't want that do not hire you.
Yeah.
Because I find it very unfair for clients to find that out when it's too late.
Yeah.
And there is, especially for those small projects, at some point, clients feel desperate that no one else will want to take on their project. So they're afraid of changing contractor because it wasn't the right fit. And therefore, they're stuck. And, these contractors, they know they're stuck. Yeah. And they're not changing their protocols either to appease the client. And I just find it upsetting because it becomes about satisfying the contractor versus satisfying yourself and the money you're spending into for yourself.
That's an interesting point. So this is a mistake. Actually, this is really important. This is something that I hadn't written down, but this is a very important thing that clients should understand. And it's a mistake we see very often, especially in smaller projects, is clients, they end up doing a lot of thinking and effort and time and energy spent into trying to appease the contractor. Well, I am not sure he wants to do it that way, so I'm not going to ask. Or he says no, so we're going to do it that way because it's going to be easier for him. And for us, of course, our background is anything can be built, and anything can be built provided you have the time and the money. In our minds, it's like that is the complete opposite of what should be taking place, right? Literally, the contractor is hired for, here's this design, here's this thing, go make it, and tell me how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. That's it. Now, there are cases when a contractor will come back to the architect and say, you drew this, but I don't think this is going to perform well. I have performance concerns. This thing's not going to weather well, or whatever the issue is, right? So let's talk about it. That's fine. But I think in a lot of cases, clients make this decision who don't have construction background and construction knowledge as architects do. And they say, well, it seems like they're not certain they can do it, so I'm not going to push it. And in the case of, again, small contractors, for us, it's like, no, that's possible. I've seen it done literally 100 times.
I know.
Of course you can do it. And this is where it gets into kind of shady territory, because then you come across contractors who just start saying stuff. Can't do it. Sorry, it's not possible. No, it's false. One, anything is possible. Okay. Two, this is easily possible because I've seen it done many times. We were talking with an architect friend who has a business in a different state, and he does, high-end residential work. Some of it's very, very high-end, and some of it's kind of like medium high-end in terms of construction quality. And he knows this. And there's a specific detail that takes place in a lot of modern and contemporary houses. It's a reveal at the bottom of a wall. Instead of having a baseboard, the thing you stick on, it's just a reveal, a little gap. And there's a metal channel, let's say, that you put in there that creates that reveal. This is done all over the world, all over the United States. It's probably being done right now in hundreds of different projects right now. And yet where he's located, there tends to be contractors who just don't want to do it. There's some that can, and because they're the rare ones, they charge like a ridiculous amount of money to do it. And from a construction standpoint, it's not a difficult thing to install. You put in the channel, let's call it a channel, stick it in there, you put the drywall on, and then that's kind of it.
Yeah.
So, and yet you do have builders and subs. It's not possible. It is impossible to do, or it's going to cost you 4 times the price for me to do it. And I was talking to this architect, and he told me this, and I laughed. I'm like, are you serious? Are they saying this? He's like, yeah, they will ask for like multiple times the price to do this detail. And we were talking, and he's like, I know it doesn't cost 3 times the price because the labor is about the same from one to the next. It's not 3 times the labor. And the material for that channel is the same, if not less, than the baseboard in some cases. So there's no way it should be costing me 3 times the price. And this is where, as a client, you should not be assuming that a contractor can't do stuff. You should be relying on your architect and designer as another source of information, not the only source, but as another source of information to determine whether or not this is doable and whether or not it makes sense for the project. But gosh, I see so often in small projects where clients are kind of bending to the will of the contractor. Yeah. And like, this is the complete, you're the client. They're the service.
Yeah,
they're the how-to person. Their expertise is how-to and how to problem solve new things. That is their offering. And if they can't do that, don't use them. And certainly don't, fit into their limited set of skill set. That makes no sense at all.
And don't agree. Like you should demand what it is that you want, and that's what you should be getting. To an extent, the whole the specific base detail reveal too. That also shows why you need transparency in pricing. Because if you are just getting a big number, then you're like, well, it just costs that much. It's what it is. Mm-hmm. But if you see the breakdown and you're basically noticing that they're upcharging you because they don't want to do it, then it's not right. Yep. They shouldn't be charging you more because they don't want to do it. Like that's...
No.
In that case, don't take on the job. Like that's just taking advantage of people.
There is a threshold. I mean... So let's say we're working on a proper high-end large house. It's not like a small project like we're describing. And on that project, there's a detail that is just atypical and weird. And we've problem solved it on our end through the drawing and figured out, okay, we need the flashing to work this way and the extrusion to whatever things to take place. And this is what it's going to be. And the contractor looks at it and they say, okay, let's have a conversation to see how we can make it better. Like that, in some cases, the contractor might say, look, this is totally foreign territory for everybody on the project. We need to make sure we do it right. So we're going to spend extra time in it, and we're going to do mock-ups. We're going to do X, Y, and Z things. Therefore, it's going to cost you a bit more money. That's totally valid. But again, where that threshold is between that type of, it's legitimately requiring more time and money to research this versus they're just charging you because they want to and they don't want to do it, or because they don't know how to do it when they should. Where that line is, again, architect, the designer, assuming they're good, they have construction knowledge, that's another source of information. So the question then for anyone listening is, well, how do I find a good contractor if my project is small?
As your designer or architect, to recommend if you to start.
Yeah.
It's always the safest place because, of course, you can look up, the 10 guys that work next to you, or you can ask your neighbor who they've used, right? And actually asking someone to recommend a contractor that they've already worked with before is somewhat of a first vetting. I would
you say someone, you mean an architect or someone as in a friend?
I'm saying anyone.
Okay.
It's some sort of vetting, but I would say that if it comes from a non-professional person, that's a different kind of vetting than the professional aspect, because it goes back to the collaboration, the transparency, the experience, the level of workmanship. So, ideally you would want to have it referred by a client and a designer rather than just a client.
The other thing too is, and this is something that I think clients don't know about, is at least where we practice, which is mostly on the West Coast and a bit not on the West Coast, a lot of the high-end, top-tier, like almost the best of the best contractors, they have, and they're bigger operations, and they do giant houses with giant budgets, right? They have a special teams division, or a special projects division, or a small projects division, or a maintenance division. All of that stuff is kind of wrapped up into one division in their operation, and that's a special group of people within their company, and they basically do small projects. They do small projects for repeat clients, especially. They do small projects that would be more like renovations, repairs, and things for projects they did in the past. And if you're lucky, they will also take on your project, which is a new project, if they feel like it makes sense for them.
And if not, there probably know good smaller contractors who would be interested in taking your project on, which is probably the, one of the best way to find a contractor is to go through the big guys, because they would not recommend someone who's not good.
I would hope so. So, but back to what I was saying though, is that if you're just a client and you're cold calling a contractor, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to, let's say, convince that big contractor to take on your small project through their small projects division. And to be honest, unless you have a certain profile, if you're super wealthy, you're a celebrity, or you're in a great neighborhood, there's something for them to gain from the project, then they'll maybe take it on. But if that doesn't exist for you, you're probably not going to get them to do it. But what you can do is have your architect or designer approach that contractor who maybe knows that. We've done it, honestly, that we get a small client comes to us, we say, hey, let's do the projects. We get a contractor, we'll call the big contractors we know and say, hey, we have the small thing. I know it's not your MO, but I also know you have a special projects division. Do you want to help these people out? They're good people. It's going to be fun, and it's us working on it. And not always, but a good amount of time, they'd be like, yeah, let's go for it. So I think that's, I guess, sort of reemphasizing that relationship aspect of how everyone decides to take on a project.
The third person that, of course, you need to hire for a project of any size, right, a small or a large project, is most likely structural engineers. So kind of like
if you're moving walls and things.
If you're moving or building new walls or changing openings or whatever, you're probably going to need a structural engineer. In like the smaller size project, a lot of times, and I would say probably smaller time engineer would have a tendency to oversize things.
Yeah.
Just to be safe in the design. So it's not so much about efficiency, because efficiency requires more hours to refine something, more hours of work.
You mean structural efficiency?
Yes.
Okay.
Versus if you don't have that much time you can spend because of the fee, right? Everything's proportional to the fee.
Sure.
Therefore, you oversize to make sure it works rather than having to dig into like the nitty-gritty of things.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's happening there is that an oversized structural design, which is like, let's just say it's the beams, columns, and foundations. It's more complicated than that, but that, in terms of people understand, when it's oversized, it costs way more to build, and it costs more for the material as well. So what in that case, what the client's doing is that you are paying less for an engineer, but in the end, you're paying way more for this oversized engineering, which you did not need. And what you would rather do, obviously, is spend more on the engineer because their fee is bites. It's very small compared to the architect's fee. It's very small compared to the contractor's fee. And it's very, very small compared to the construction costs. So you'd rather pay that tiny percentage, that tiny amount, you'd rather pay more, maybe it's double the amount, to save big on construction. Everyone's always concerned about the total project cost. And the mistake that clients make is they try to squeeze the professionals, right? And some of that makes sense, and I understand it. But really, the like 70% of the project cost, or maybe 80% or 60% of the project cost, it depends, is just the construction. So that's actually where you want to be trying to save. And what I'm saying is by using good professionals broadly and specifically engineers, that's exactly how you save. An engineer is going to design something that actually makes sense and is efficient, because a good engineer wants to be efficient. That's what they love. They love efficiency.
Yeah, and I think, if people are like, well, where would I find a structural engineer? It goes back to the same thing as the contractor. I think use your architect or designer, or call up the big guys and ask them for a recommendation. We've came across projects sometimes where maybe an engineer was recommended, and they're kind of like doing bigger project or commercial work on such things, and they ended up overcharging for their service for what needed to be done, because they just didn't want to do it. They got caught up and did it, but that was not really their thing. But if you use a connection from another professional connection to find one, I don't think that happens as much.
I agree, and I also like the previous thing you said about the same professionals referring other professionals. So yes, you can talk to your architect to find a contractor, find an engineer, absolutely. But so in the case of hiring an architect, talk to a really large office that you feel like there's no way I can hire these people. Go for it. And they might do it. If they don't want to do it, then they're going to know other professionals who are smaller sized, hungry, younger, or maybe they know, oh, I know this person. They're very good, but I know they happen to need work. Talk to this person.
Because at the end of the day, you don't want just to have a name. You want to make a match. Right.
Yes.
And who's better to make a match than someone who knows a lot of people and that can match you with the right person? So rather than ask your neighbor, Paul, to recommend a structural engineer to you, well, maybe call up the big guys, ask what you're trying to do, and immediately they have like 3 names that they could give you that you can call. But it's interesting because the whole matchmaking it's not just about like, how much are they going to cost me? It's about the personality. It's about like, where do they work? What do they work on? Their experience, their knowledge. There is different aspects. That's why you should never go with the guy that your neighbor recommended first, because the odds of it, working out, like there's a lot of criteria that need to be filled in order for it to work out. So
I agree.
And it's always good to have a few options too. Like when you ask those bigger firms to refer you to people, they're probably going to give you like 1 or 2 names. Like you're not tied to just the first one. Yeah,
absolutely. So those are the professionals. A few other things to consider is that obviously if you have a tighter budget, you do have to recognize and be honest with yourself, client, that there are going to be material and design constraints. You won't be able to afford probably the nicest, most exotic, interesting marbles or woods or metals or whatever else. You might not be able to afford the top end fabricator. It also means that in terms of design, the scope might not be as big as you want it to be. You have this vision of, I want to change the complete interior of the house. I want to do this addition on the side and on the top and build this thing in the backyard and build this pool. That might not all happen. So you kind of have to choose. And you should work with your architect or designer on this. Do I try and take my resources, my money, and kind of spread it out? Sometimes that's appropriate. That's much more difficult to do. Or do I focus it on this thing now and then phase the project to later? But just recognize that you are gonna there is much more constraints being placed because of budget, and that's the reality. And I think a good architect and designer can do a lot of things with a small budget, but there is for sure a threshold. And when you work with that architect, they'll help you understand where that threshold is. So I don't want people to think that we can work magic. We can't turn dust into gold. It doesn't work that way. But still, we can do a lot by using resources effectively.
Well, and that's why, again, if there is transparency in the budget, there is a better understanding for the designer or the architect on how we can be spending that money. If it means like, well, going a bit cheaper on the cabinets instead of custom, you go with like a kitchen system.
Yeah.
And maybe that allows us to get like an actual natural stone countertop rather than like a quartz. That's very helpful. It's about, again, allocating resources where it makes the most sense for the client and for the scope of work.
It does. And so I think the big takeaway with this one is more of a personality kind of mental approach check that you have to do as a client. Is you have to know that you're going to have to make compromises. So if you're the type of person who's like ultra specific with everything, and you know this, and you're the type of person who when you want something, you must have it, and you know this, well, in the design and construction process, you're either going to have to make a compromise, which goes against your personality, or you're going to have to spend more money. So there is that tipping point, and I think it is worthwhile for people to, again, kind of just be honest with yourself. And you have to recognize, if you're going to use a tight budget, you're going to have to make compromises. That's the way it works.
Yeah, I think it's about being realistic with the expectations, right? And acknowledging that you're at this certain level, and this is what's possible, and beyond that or below that is not acceptable, and above that might be more difficult.
Yeah.
And also, so the last thing is, of course, you get what you pay for in those selection items, meaning that quality often depends on how much money you're spending. That being said, though, I feel like if you decided to hire an architect or a designer for your small project, these people will most likely be the best person to guide you into where you should be what you should be purchasing for the for the budget you have available.
Yeah.
Designers and architects are extremely knowledgeable as to like all of the products out there, the different range of products, the quality, and they are lasting in time. Mm-hmm. So, if you go on your own to do those things, you select those things by yourself, you're probably going to be looking at the price tag and maybe read some comments online and like reviews to figure it out. But there is these people who have years of experience, and you're not their first project, and they would tell you like, okay, these are the 3 brands you should be looking at for the price range and the quality we're looking for.
Yep. And feedback. Sometimes it's on the high end where it's, you're interested in this. I don't think it's worth the money. I think we can spend our money, your money, more intelligently on other things. And this thing, by the time it gets installed, you're not going to notice the difference between A and B options. So I would actually advocate for going for the more cost-effective option in this case. Now, of course, in some cases, clients, they just fall in love with this one thing, and and the cost for that thing is totally disproportionate to the rest of the project. And that's totally fine too.
And look, if it's this one thing who brings them joy when the project is done, and it's, I don't want a client to ever regret something that they wanted if they could have done it, then looking back like, oh, I should have done it.
Yeah.
Because it's this small thing that would just bring them excitement and happiness every time they use it or see it. And it's it's rare. Like you don't get that from, I don't know, like kitchen door hinges, But if you do, and it's like $10 more, and you have 5 hinges, then do it, because it's gonna be worth it. It's gonna make you feel better about the completion of it.
Yeah, and I think that applies especially to details. I think it applies to details and small things like outlets. I'm thinking of specifically, the Bochi ones that fit into the wall. Like that is the 22 system.
Yeah.
Like people, you have to look it up, this outlet system. But, it's small things like that. It's like extremely expensive for that item. But if you just have a few of them, right, and and it's this very special moment. You're going to look at it every day and you're like, this brings me joy because I'm that kind of individual, then maybe it's worth it.
Yeah.
Conversely, we'll also tell clients sometimes when they're looking at things and we're showing them things, or maybe they found stuff on their own, actually, is the case I'm thinking of, and they present it to us and say, what about this item? So yeah, that's that company. I don't know if I would use that company. I know it's cheaper than the option we showed you by whatever amount, but I wouldn't advise it. Or sometimes it's, I don't know, so let me do some research and see, and then kind of give an informed opinion.
So of course, on these small projects, depending on who you hire and for what, I think the client involvement could become this huge thing that could be kind of like not a full-time job, but it could end up being pretty close to a full-time job. And that means, a lot of just staying on top of it, kind of like being the person running it. It becomes stressful. It becomes overwhelming. It becomes obsessional. That's the only thing you're thinking of. And ultimately, I think it affects your judgment on the decisions you have to make on the project. So, again, skipping hiring the designer or an architect for your project could, in theory, save you some money, but it comes with an aftermath of what that implies, which is all of those things. So
yeah, and we did talk about some of the ramifications of clients being more involved in projects and the challenges of it. I would say that, just speaking earnestly, the vast majority of people, they overestimate their capacity to be involved in a project like as we're describing. Even if it's, let's say we're talking about a interiors remodel where it's a kitchen, living room, and bathroom, a small scope. They overestimate their willingness to go through that, and they underestimate how much time, energy, and effort and headache it's going to take. And we've worked with clients who have led significant parts of the project, like legitimately, and it's gone well. But those people, first of all, are very special, rare people. And in the cases that I'm thinking of, they had backgrounds and actual professional experience in the building industry one way or another. So they understood and understand what it means to go through that process. So I would be, if I were a client and I had no background in construction or design, and even if I was really good in my own profession, I would be very cautious in assuming that I'm going to be able to, lead or partially lead or take over some of the services that typically a professional would do. Again, there are rare people that are type A, very, very, you got to be super organized, and you got to be thorough, and you got to be fast.
And you got to be resilient. And patient.
Those are patient. Kind of like, the list goes on. Yeah.
No, but those are two big qualities. You have to be patient because it's a process that takes time. And if you're the type of person who runs the show and like rush it, it's probably not going to work. And you have to be resilient because I feel like a lot of times clients who, let's say, run the project or do more on the project than maybe others do, they have excitement. They're happy. They're like, let's go from the first few months, and then that wears out, and that turns into, I just want to be done. I'm tired of it. I can't wait to having it being over, and that's the worst feeling I think you want in a project that's under construction.
Because that's where bad decisions
Because that's where bad decisions happen. That's where a relationship, just dies. That's where the communication becomes unpleasant, and things just no one is bringing their best to the game, and that's not how you get the best outcome for a project. So, if you're neither patient or resilient, I would say that you definitely need a professional to help you at a certain level. Yeah,
and I think also what we're talking about really is before you start a project and determine what professionals, protocols, and level of services you will choose to have on the project, you as a client need to be very honest with yourself as to who you are naturally and what you are interested in sincerely in terms of level of engagement, and also external factors of how much time do you actually have.
Yeah.
If you have your own business and you have 2 kids and something else going on, unless you're one of these people who can work on 2 hours of sleep consistently every night for a couple months or a year, it doesn't really matter what your skill set is then.
Well, and I think that the decision of doing it yourself or hiring someone, it all goes back to like, well, why would you not be hiring someone?
Right.
Is it it to save a few bucks? Mm-hmm. Is it because you think you would do a better job at it, and that's another issue? Is it because you've done it already and you know you could do it again? Mm-hmm. Or why is it that you want to hire someone else? But I think asking yourself that question before even skipping it is super important, because it is. If it is about money, clearly it's not where you save.
I think what also happens very often is the clients think, well, let's start with this process that's a little bit more of a skeleton crew, see how it goes. And I can always switch gears if I need to. And that's true. However, there's this human tendency for once something has started, once a process or project has started, there's a tendency to let those systems that are there just continue until it's too late. And then at some point, when there's problems happening, you think, well, let's see if we can just get past this problem. And then there's another one. Okay, let's just get past this next one. And that repeats. And suddenly weeks, months go by, and you're having to deal with all these issues because you didn't set up the right people in the first place. Yeah. And you thought at the beginning, well, let's just see how it goes, which is to imply that, I can always change things. But realistically, are you going to change things? Are you going to fire somebody and bring on someone else in the middle of a project? That's a very, very difficult thing to do, honestly, and very rare to do. And usually if it gets to the point of where a client's actually going to do that, that means it's been really bad for a very long time, and it's all bad vibes. Yeah. Right. So that's the other thing too. It doesn't mean that whoever you hire at the beginning, you are fully committed to them, but just the way it all works out, that tends to be what happens. So I would say if you're on that fence, I would generally encourage people to just be more cautious and prudent with, who you hire, rather than kind of rolling dice and thinking, well, we can always improvise and change as we go along. Yeah. Because it doesn't work that way, The final point, of course, is the quality of the professionals you hire, which we've talked about. And I do want to be clear that in general, if you're working with good professionals, they are going to cost more money than others. And they also will probably cost more money proportional to the project size and the construction budget. So, for example, an architect, let's say they're typically between 10 to 15% of construction cost as a fee. Somewhere in that zone. 10 is a little bit low, 15 is on the higher end, but it's somewhere in there, right? If your project is very small, their fee proportional to the construction cost might be more like 20%, or maybe even a little bit above 20%. But, again, most clients that we know of, once they go through the process, if you had told them you could spend an additional 5% of on the architect's fee to save you all the time and headache, they would have been like, yeah, it probably would have been worth it, because it drained me, So,
the conclusion on this small project is I would still not skip the design professional, because in the end, they could, they should be making the process more efficient and the construction cost more efficient. Mm-hmm. Not having them means that it's all on you. You have to make the right decisions on your own. You have to run the process of the project on your own efficiently.
Yeah, and I think, as we said before, when you're paying for a project, you're paying for the outcome, of course. But, since these projects take months or years, you're really actually paying for a service. And a good service equals good outcome. Bad service equals oftentimes bad outcome. Or if it's a good outcome, it's a good outcome with a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And again, most people, they don't want to go through that pain. And look, everyone has a budget. You know what I mean? Like, people who don't have a lot of money, they have a budget. People who have a lot of money, they have a budget too. Right. No, everyone has a personal, emotional comfort level, a threshold, with how much they want to spend. And it's a funny thing too. It's that emotional weight is the same from one person to the next, regardless of what their net worth is, and regardless of what the project budget is. So, in a way, actually, a lot of what we're talking about equally applies to larger scale projects, right? I find that these processes, doing the projects, but also helping clients is about helping them find the right paths. Yes, but I think most of the time it's about avoiding the wrong paths.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I mean, there is kind of like those easy things to watch for to avoid the wrong path.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Give us an outro.
Thanks everybody for listening to this Project Companion. If you like what we do, please follow us on anywhere you can. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, pretty much anywhere you can find us.
Mm-hmm.
We also have the hotline, so if you have any question about this recording, or if you're in a bind on one of your projects, or you don't know how to start yours, you can shoot us a text message or leave us a voicemail. The number is 213-222-6950. We also have all of our podcast episodes and more, especially in this category, on our website, secondstudiopod.com.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
What else is you can find our office also everywhere online. Reach out to us. We appreciate everyone listening and watching, and stay tuned for more. Bye.
Bye-bye.